Welcome back to our basic solar system, part 3, where we add a third panel and talk about it. I want to start this episode by asking a simple question, something that I thought about when I started out. When it comes to placing your inverter, and you have a choice of long DC cables, direct current cables that run to your solar panels, and AC cables that run from the inverter to the wall, if you will, where do you position the inverter? Is it better to have longer DC cables, or is it better to have longer AC cables? In order to answer the question, do we want to run longer DC cables or longer AC cables, we need to talk about electricity and volts and amps and watts and the relationship between the two and so on. So if I picked a 12 volt system, a 12 volt DC system for a reason, it is essentially 1/10 of the 120 volts AC in my house. So I picked that deliberately and wanted to do some correlations. So let's talk about electricity and volts and amps and how do we calculate power and watts. So all of you have heard of the formula that volts times amps equals watts. But what are volts and what are amps? Some of us may have heard the analogy of water that volts are pressure, like pressure in a garden hose or pressure in your faucet. I like to think of volts as speed. I'm a car guy, so I sort of equate that to miles per hour. So volts is how fast electricity moves. So what are amps? Well, amps are equated to, in a water analogy, to current, if you will. I like to think of them as how much electricity are we moving. And there's an interesting correlation and difference between DC and AC. I think of DC as slowly moving a lot of amps. Think of a car battery. A car battery in your vehicle is called a 12 volt battery, but it has something like 750 cranking amps, right? That's a ton of amps. So it pushes a ton of power, ton of power slowly. Whereas in your house, we have 120 volts. So that's like going 120 miles per hour, but something like a light bulb may be using half a volt. So when comparing the two electricities, we can get the same amount of power in two different ways. In our example of 12 volt system, a solar panel moves 5 amps at 12 volts. So let's say at 12 miles an hour, if you will. And that 12 times 5 gives us 60 watts, right? Whereas inside the walls, a light bulb will pull half an amp at 120 volts, 120 miles an hour, still for 60 watts. In the old days, before LEDs and fluorescents, it was common to find something like a 60 watt light bulb in your house or a 40 watt light bulb. So how do you get 60 watts out of 120 volts? You actually have to multiply it by half, or half an amp, to go from 120 down to 60 for 60 watts. Anyway, knowing that DC is usually lower voltage, higher amps, whereas AC is higher voltage and lower amps, what cables do we use? What wires do we use to wire our system? If we think about how the world is wired, if we think about how the United States is wired, do we have DC power lines or do we have AC power lines running across the country? We have AC, alternating current, spanning from the East Coast to the West Coast and so on. That's because it's more efficient to move smaller amount of amps at a faster speed, faster pressure, higher pressure, if you will. So we have 120 volts, 220 volts, and then the power lines reach up into the thousands. So to answer our earlier question, it is better, if possible, to run longer AC cables than DC cables, all right? But let's just talk about cables for a minute. So I had to change the scenery here a little bit. The sun was just casting some funny shadows on me through the patio cover. Anyway, let's talk about DC cables for a minute. And if we remember back to our second video, we're adding panels in parallel. And what that means is that the voltage stays the same. So although this is 3 panels of 12 volts each, it's still a 12-volt system. What parallel does, it adds up the amps. These panels are rated to deliver 5 amps each. So 5 amps plus another 5 amps is 10, plus another 5 amps is 15. When I first started building the system, I knew I needed some solar panel cables, so I went on Amazon and I pretty much just was concerned with cable length. I knew nothing really about it. So I bought what ended up being a 10-foot 12 gauge solar panel cable. And that works fine. But something what we want to consider as we add panels is the gauge of our cables. And gauge really means thickness, if you will, not so much of the external conduit as it means the thickness of the wire strands that are inside of the cable. I wouldn't suggest just any types of cables for your solar panels because there's all kinds of ratings for them and they're expected to be ran outdoors and be protected from the sun and UV rays and all kinds of stuff. But something that to consider is the gauge or the thickness. The lower the number, the actual bigger the cable, the thicker the cable, and the thicker the cable, the further they can run. So when we are installing solar panels, I wouldn't say it's tricks, but there's certain things you can do to avoid running longer cables or needing longer cables. Let's say we have these 3 solar panels and they're going to be pushing up to 15 amps and we want to run them, let's say 40 feet. So for 40 feet, let's say we want to use a 10 gauge cable. Well, if we don't want to go out and buy a 10 gauge cable, we could move them closer, say to 20 feet, and maybe then a thinner cable, a 12 gauge cable would work. The rules of thumb on cables is that the resistance doubles as the length of the cable doubles. So if you had a 10-foot cable and then you went and it had a certain type of resistance meaning sort of like a bottleneck effect or a funnel or like a dam, something that's blocking the progress or the flow. So whatever the resistance is of a 10-foot long cable, as you double the length to 20 feet, you're doubling the resistance. So this 10-foot cable may work fine for 1 panel and for 2 panels, but as soon as we add a 3rd panel, now this might have too much of a resistance. And so then we would need to either stop running a 10-foot cable, move our panels closer to the inverter, let's say go to a 5-foot cable, if that's practical, or we need to go and get a thicker cable, a lower gauge number, so go from a 12 to a 10 or an 8, and then we can run a longer distance. I hope this is making some sense. Now, something I've come to realize is that, or a question that I have is, can we really trust the gauges on Amazon? I mean, we're dealing with kind of a cheap implementation here. So I'm just trying to pose some questions for you, introduce some topics, take all of this as with a grain of salt. Is this truly 12 gauge? I don't know. This is made overseas, right? Is there a cable gauge police? I doubt it. Is this really a 10 gauge? Maybe, maybe not. Also, just because we go from a 12 gauge to a 10 gauge, maybe this 12 gauge has better wires, actual better metal material making up the wire strands than this one that claims to be a 10 gauge. So something for you guys just to think about. I just want to introduce the topic. All right, so now let's talk about the AC side, the output side of this inverter. In earlier videos, I mentioned that I really like this inverter because it happens to use a standard power cord. And I think this might be something like 4 feet. But the nice thing is that we can get this type of cord in any length ranging from literally 1 foot all the way to what I think this is here, 8 feet. I've seen them as long as 18 feet. The point is that when possible, on the AC side, run a single cable, okay? Avoid extensions cords if possible. So ideally, shorter cables are the way to go. If you can mount this thing on the wall and use a 1-footer to plug it into the outlet, then do so. If you need to use the standard length, so be it. If you need to go beyond that, use a longer cord. So although in an earlier video I mentioned that given a choice between running longer DC cables or AC cables, it's better to run longer AC cables, we want to do that but avoid extension cords. There are certain rules and regulations against extension cords. They are fine for short terms or temporary solutions. You'll see them on construction zones. And the funny thing is, you'll see them around Christmas time and holidays. And believe it or not, there is an exemption that allows us to run extension cords during the holidays for up to 90 days, which I find that to be a bit comical, that all the hazards seem to go away during the holidays, you know, the tripping hazards, the fire hazards, and so on. And all the violations that you're susceptible for 9 months out of the year, for 3 months around the holiday season, it's completely fine to string bazillions of extension cords around your house so you can put up Christmas lights. So anyway, that was really an eye-opening thing to discover. The next thing I want to talk about is an improvement we can make on the AC side in terms of monitoring the data. So in prior videos, we talked about the kilowatt, and then we've talked about the new and improved kilowatt. And now I want to bring up something called a smart plug. This is by Emporia. And what this allows us to do is get to our data remotely from our phones, from our computers. It basically uses Wi-Fi to give us not only real-time data, but also keeps historical data. So it's like this guy with Wi-Fi or on steroids. And we can combine the two. Actually, sometimes I just plug in my smart plug into the kilowatt meter, and the kilowatt shows me real-time display right there at the plug. This one doesn't happen to have a display. And then we simply plug our inverter into here, and we can get the best of both worlds. We can get the data on our iPhone, and we can see it right there at the plug. Of course, we don't need this. We can simply plug this into an outlet and get our data on our iPhones or on our computer wirelessly. Let me show you how that works. Okay, let's see how this works. So to monitor our AC output, we can use something called Emporia Smart Plug. Here I want to show you the company's website. And right here on their very home page, we can see they offer different types of products, and one of them is called a smart plug. So if we go in here, we can see that these things are sold in a single pack, 2 and 4 in a pack. The price looks like maybe it went up a tad, but I paid $10 for mine on Amazon, and then I noticed that you can buy them from the website, free shipping, and the price was exactly the same. So if you want to just jump in and get started, I suggest you just buy the one plug. The very nice thing about this particular smart plug versus the bazillion other competitors is that you can see they show a monitor here, which means their application actually runs on a regular computer, which I really like, and I'll demo that for you. And of course, just like all the other ones, they have an app for it, which runs on your smartphone. Sometimes what you get on this small smartphone screen is just too small for me, and I'll demonstrate that for you, or it just doesn't have enough detail. So this is the Emporia portal, if you will. You can create an account for free. There is no software to download, and you can access this on their website, obviously anywhere in the world. So it's very accessible and very portable. Now, as you can see that I have maybe a dozen plugs here. I went out and bought all these plugs and plugged them in all over the house. Pretty self-explanatory. I have them plugged in and labeled, so there's a garage fridge, a regular fridge, computer, and so on. Now among them, I've created one called solar 12 volt system and another one called solar 24 volt system. The interesting thing here, and one of the workarounds that we're using, is that these smart plugs are one directional, and so they don't know if we're consuming energy or if we're creating energy. So this is one of the imperfections of this system. To this Emporia energy portal, our solar systems, our solar panels are essentially consuming energy rather than producing it. But that's okay. It doesn't impact our electrical bill. It's just something you need to be aware of. And I am totally fine with that because I just love their really clean graphs, and now I can see visual data. Okay, so let's take a look at how this system works and how granular it is. And I'll point out some of the things I like about it and some of the things that drive me a bit crazy. So no other system did I see actual breakdown into second intervals. I've looked at maybe half a dozen, if not a dozen competitors. Um, Actually, Emporia was the first plug I bought, but I'm one of these people that, hey, if this one is so good, then are there some better ones out there? I went out and I bought other plugs, and I've tried all kinds of different plugs and systems and learned way too much about smart homes and smart plugs. And this one is really the best for what we want to use it for, which is monitoring our solar production. So here we can see a second per second view. I hardly ever use this. Most of the time I'm in the minutes view, which shows us the current consumption, and it's the number right here. Okay, this interface takes a little while getting used to. There are some flaws in it. One is we cannot see what each individual bar, specifically the value of it, what it says. But there's a trick, and if you drag this to the right, like I'm currently dragging it, and you notice this number is changing. So currently this is the current value, and it's 168 watts per minute. If we slide this thing over to the right, then now it's this bar. And if we go further, now it's this bar, and here it is. So this is a bit of a pain in the butt and a workaround for the way it works. I wish we could just highlight a bar and it would show us the value here, but that's not how it works, okay? So this is the average rate per minute. Another thing that drives me crazy about this interface is their scale here. This is dynamic, and see how it says 0.21 currently, but as we shift over, now it changed to 0.16, yet it kind of, the graph maintains the same size, and it didn't really drop off like it drops off here. So watch, we go to this area, and this says 0.16, but you know, the graph 0.21, and then the graph still occupies sort of the same space. Anyway, that's something I wanted to point out. So it's This is one of the things that I don't like. I've sent an email to the company, and they have really good tech support, and they are very accepting of feedback and promising to work on their product and promising to implement some of the feature requests that people are submitting. So the next thing I want to demonstrate is the hourly view. The hourly view shows us sort of the bell curve of solar production. And here we can see each one of these bars represents an hour. So I think this is yesterday, and you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We were producing some sort of power for 12 hours. We can slide over and see similar patterns. This is really interesting. This particular solar 12-volt system currently is facing east. It's not in the optimal location, just laying on the roof of my house. It doesn't have the optimal angle. And you can see here that it peaks, I believe, at 11 o'clock. So that's the highest bar on all of them, and then it starts dropping off. And then as the sun moves around my house and casts a shadow on these panels, the production declines. But this is pretty much what your solar production will look like. It ramps up in the morning, obviously, peaks out, and then dissipates. So I use the minute view to see how my system is doing at a point in time, in real time, what I call it. I'll glance at this to kind of see how long it's producing. And then the daily is pretty interesting. My graph right now is all over the place because I've been experimenting and playing around so much. And I've also just recently started using this particular account. So the weekly view, the monthly view is limited, and the yearly view here. But you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different views you can have, and by far that is the richest out of all of these smart plugs. So this is my favorite system, and I highly recommend it.